Hi, so I'm doing one of those double YouTube lessons today, both for writing for children and for my nonsense class. So the numbers are 28, lesson 28, stuff of nonsense, and lesson 23 for writing for children. Okay, so I want to talk about a concept called synchronicity. It's actually Jung, and in the nonsense class, we talked about Carl Gustav Jung, who was a colleague of Freud's, initially kind of a student of Freud's, but then went on to form his own approach called the Jungian approach. So Jung talked about this thing called, or concept, I guess, called synchronicity. And synchronicity is kind of a cool thing to talk about towards the end of a week, and especially because you guys are all working on creative projects. And that's why I'm able to do both classes in one YouTube today. So synchronicity is when sort of something happens and it feels like it was meant to be, like, wow, I was just at the right place at the right time and that thing happened. And anyway, okay. So what I wanted to tell you about is my experience as a person that works on books and even the newspaper stories, is that synchronicity really does happen. To me, it especially happens once I've really sort of gotten invested in a project. I start, and maybe it's not synchronicity, maybe it's because you're invested, but I like to think it's synchronicity. So let's say I'm working on a topic, I don't know, years ago I did a book on self-mutilation, a pretty difficult topic. And then I would turn on the radio and there'd be an episode on self-mutilations. Okay, so it's when things happen, you're just like in the right place at the right time. And I really believe that when you're invested, like your heart's in a project, things happen. Okay, so in writing for children, this week, I've been doing my YouTubes about my book called What World Is Left. It's a historical novel based on my mom's experience in a concentration camp. Okay, so you don't need to know all the stuff that the other class writing for children learned. Now I'm talking to the nonsense students. What I want to tell you about is some events of synchronicity, okay? So then you'll understand it better, and perhaps once you're aware of synchronicity, you'll be more likely to notice it happening around you, and maybe it will happen around you while you're working for both classes on your final projects. Okay, so when I was working on the book, I had to do a lot of research. So of course there was book research, there was interviews with my mom who lived in Montreal at the time, but some of my research brought me to Holland, which was where my mom came from. So she came from a little town, beautiful town called Broek en Waterland. By the way, jot it down. If you're planning ever to go to Holland, I hope you go. You should go to that town. It's gorgeous. It's about 20 minutes outside of Amsterdam. Anyway, when I was in Amsterdam, I wasn't expecting to go. I had a very tight schedule. I had appointments with people. I had appointments at museums. I was going to look at documents. I had a busy week planned. So one morning, my hotel, it just happened to be near the bus station, which is, by the way, where the train station is. Everything is the big station in downtown Amsterdam. It's a very convenient place to visit in many ways, and a beautiful city. Anyway, so it was full of buses. I was just walking past the station, and I speak a little bit of Dutch. It's not great, but anyway, I manage. So there must have been 30 buses, 40, but full of buses. So I just stepped onto one bus and I said to the bus driver, like, how do you get to Broek en Waterland? Which would be the bus that I would take? And the bus driver turned and looked at me and he said, this is the bus to Broek en Waterland. I only make one stop and that's where we go. So, okay, that's synchronicity, okay, that I got on the bus. So if synchronicity happens or something like that happens, my experience and my advice to you is follow it. So I had an appointment somewhere else, or it was a tentative appointment. It doesn't matter. I didn't go to the other appointment that day. I postponed it. I stayed on that bus and I went to Broek en Waterland. And then more crazy things started to happen to me. It was like that day was my day in my life for synchronicity. So my mom had told me the address of the street where she grew up, and I had visited that house when I was a very little girl, a vague memory of it. So I get to the street in the town and there is no such number. I walk up and down, no number, no number. So I see a mailman, and in Holland, the mailmen, they're all on bicycles. So the mailman's on a bicycle. I figure I'll ask him. I had the number written down as my mom had told me. She was already quite old. He said, there's no such number. She got the number wrong. Okay, so now I'm looking at the houses. I can't see it. So he said, ring that doorbell. There's an old guy that lives there. Okay, ring the doorbell. He might know. He might remember where your mom used to live. So for the writing for, oh no, none of you have read the book. Anyway, in the book, okay, now I realize I'm going to go on a little long today, but still, this is good, this synchronicity stuff. In my book, I used the story that my mom had told me. My grandfather was a pretty well-known artist in Holland. He had success and some money, and he always loved cars. Even when I was a kid, he always drove like, I don't know, he had a, what was it called? A fancy car, Corvette. If any of you were into old cars, he had a yellow Corvette. Anyway, and that was when I was a little kid in the 60s. Okay, back to Holland. He had a beautiful car. It was the equivalent of a Cadillac. And if the Nazis had known that he had this car, it would have been confiscated and whatever. Instead, one of his friends, a Christian friend in Holland, knew that he had this beautiful car, and he hid it in his garage. And I use that in my book, that little detail about the car being hidden. So now I'm back to this little street in Holland. I ring the doorbell. The man comes out. He's like an old guy, and he hears who I am. He wants me to come in, but I'm too smart. Go into his old guy's house, even if you're old yourself. Anyway, no, I said I better stay. I didn't know him. Anyway, he comes out of the house to continue our conversation, and he brings me a painting done by my grandfather. And he said, we have this painting. My wife and I have this painting. My wife is out now. Her father was a farmer, and he hid your grandfather's old car in his garage. So like, what already another like synchronicity. Why did I meet this guy? And then he said, by the way, the house is right across the street where your mother used to live. I remember your mother and her brothers. So then I look at the house, and there's like a backhoe. They're tearing stuff down. They're working on the house. They're doing the foundation. It was a beautiful old house, but it was old. So it's like the house is a mess. The owners are not there. I ring the doorbell, nobody there. So I talked to the workers, again in my bad Dutch, and I said, my mother used to live in this house during the war. She went to a concentration camp. And anyway, they don't really seem to be paying much attention to my story. And I'm just standing there thinking like, this is the house. And I hear clink, and the guy driving the backhoe, he threw the keys to the house on the ground, on the grass. And I went into the house, and I spent hours in that house. I think almost 3 hours just walking around. I mean, the owners might not have been too happy, and taking tons of photographs because I needed, that house was part of my story. And if I hadn't gone that day, there was a really, really old kitchen, and it was being like all remodeled and made modern, but that old kitchen had the old stove that my mom grew up with. So that was pretty amazing. And then, now I'm not quite done, even though, my goodness, I'm at 8 minutes, 8 seconds, one more story. So I leave the house, and now I'm like thinking, I gotta talk to any old person. Like, where are the old people, right? So I'm walking in a little town, it's a very small town, and I find there's an old lady with a walker and a helper, okay? So now, because I'm like, oh, the old people, they might remember my family. So I talked to the old lady. I told her who I am, again, days before COVID, because we didn't have to worry about getting close, because the old lady lets go of her walker. She's like hugging me, squeezing me. She's so happy to see me. And then she told me such a beautiful little story, and it was a tiny detail, but I was able to use it in the book, because at this point I was still doing the research for the book. She would have been a little bit older than my mom and her brothers, and she said, I remember it was a very, very hot summer day in Broek en Waterland, and it was after the Nazis had come to power. And Broek en Waterland, of course, one of the beautiful things about these little towns in Holland and Amsterdam too, is that there's canals everywhere. And she said, we were gonna go, all of us, it was so hot, all the kids were gonna have a swim in the canal, but the Jews weren't allowed to swim, they weren't allowed in the water. So your mother and her brothers had to stay and watch while all the other kids swam. And she said, I've never forgotten that afternoon. And so it's a small detail, but when you write, and also when you're working on creative projects, sometimes the real beauty is in the little details, right? Like if you're painting, the brush strokes. because I was able to use that in the book. Okay, so, okay, we're at 9 minutes, 50 seconds, but think about synchronicity. Be open to it. Hey, be open, not just with your creative projects and your chapters for the Writing for Children, but in all of your lives, right? Because I think it's true. I think it's there. It was totally there for me that day, and it's been there for me other days too. So I wish you creativity. I wish you, good conversations with people, everything that, whatever it is that brings you happiness. That's what I wish you. Okay, have a good weekend. I know it's only Thursday, but I take a break from my YouTube performances on Fridays, and I'll be back on Monday. Okay, bye. I miss you, but I tell you that all the time.